The autumn leaves danced outside the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sat quietly in her private study. The golden light filtered through the glass. But inside her heart, everything felt cold and gray. She had been staring at the same page of her diary for nearly an hour, unable to write a single word. William found her there, just as he had every evening for the past 3 weeks. His footsteps were soft on the carpeted floor, but she heard him coming. She always did. After 15 years together, they could sense each other's presence without looking. "The children are asking questions again," William said gently, settling into the chair beside her desk. His voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. Catherine finally looked up from her diary. Her eyes, usually bright and sparkling, seemed dimmed by an invisible shadow. "What did you tell them?" "The truth," William replied, reaching across to take her hand. "That sometimes, even grown-ups need time to feel sad. That it's okay to cry when someone we love is no longer with us." The someone they spoke of was Catherine's grandmother, Margaret Rose, who had raised Catherine after her own parents died in a car accident when she was just 8 years old. Margaret had been more than a grandmother to Catherine. She had been her mother, her best friend, and her guide through life. 3 weeks ago, at the age of 92, Margaret had passed peacefully in her sleep at her small cottage in the English countryside. Catherine squeezed William's hand. "George asked me today if great-grand Margaret is watching him from heaven. I told him yes, but then he wanted to know why she can't come back if she loves us so much." Her voice broke slightly. "How do you explain death to a 10-year-old when you're still struggling to understand it yourself?" William moved his chair closer and wrapped his arms around his wife. "You don't have to have all the answers, darling. You never did. Remember what your grandmother always told you? That love doesn't end when someone dies," Catherine whispered, leaning into his embrace. "It just changes shape." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the trees. Outside, the world continued moving. But inside their private bubble of grief, time seemed to stand still. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity. There had been funeral arrangements to make, family members to contact, and official duties to attend to. As senior members of the royal family, William and Catherine couldn't simply disappear from public view. Even in their darkest moments, they had smiled for cameras, shaken hands with dignitaries, and attended charity events, all while carrying the heavy burden of loss in their hearts. But tonight was different. Tonight, there were no official engagements, no cameras, no expectations. Tonight, they could simply be William and Catherine, a husband and wife, grieving the loss of someone who meant the world to them. "I keep expecting to hear her voice," Catherine admitted, pulling back to look at William. "This morning, when I was having tea, I almost called out to ask if she wanted some. For a moment, I forgot she wasn't here anymore." William brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "That's not forgetting, love. That's remembering. There's a difference." Catherine managed a small smile, the first genuine one William had seen from her in weeks. She would have liked that response. "She always said you were too wise for your own good. She also said I was lucky to have found you," William replied, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. She was right about that too. The couple's conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the study door. "Mummy? Daddy?" came George's small voice from the other side. "Come in, sweetheart," Catherine called, quickly wiping her eyes. George entered the room, his dark hair messy from playing and his school uniform rumpled. Behind him came Charlotte, now 8 years old, and little Louis, who had just turned 5. The 3 children looked at their parents with the kind of intuitive understanding that children often possess about adult emotions. "We wanted to show you something," Charlotte announced, holding up a large piece of paper covered in colorful drawings and glitter. "We made a memory book for great-grand Margaret," George explained, climbing onto William's lap. "We drew pictures of all our favorite times with her." Louis, not to be outdone by his older siblings, toddled over to Catherine and thrust a slightly crumpled drawing into her hands. "I drawed her garden," he said proudly, pointing to what appeared to be a collection of green and red squiggles. Catherine's eyes filled with fresh tears. But these were different from the ones she had been shedding for weeks. These tears carried warmth, love, and the beginning of healing. "Oh, my darlings, this is beautiful. Tell me about this picture, George." George pointed to a drawing that showed stick figures sitting around a table. "This is when Great-Gran taught us how to make her special biscuits last Christmas. Remember? She said the secret ingredient was love, but I think it was really extra butter." Charlotte giggled and pointed to her own artwork. "And this is when she taught me how to braid friendship bracelets. She said every color means something different. Yellow for happiness, blue for trust, and red for love that lasts forever." William felt his own eyes growing misty as he listened to his children share their memories. Margaret Rose had been a constant presence in their lives, always ready with a story, a hug, or a homemade treat. She had attended every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every important milestone. Her absence would be felt deeply by all of them. "What about you, Louis?" Catherine asked, kneeling down to his level. "What was your favorite thing about Great-Gran?" Louis thought for a moment, his little face scrunched up in concentration. "She singed to me," he said, his pronunciation still adorably unclear. "She singed the song about the sunshine." Catherine's breath caught. "You Are My Sunshine" had been Margaret's favorite lullaby, the one she had sung to Catherine when she was frightened or sad, and later, to all three grandchildren. "Would you like to sing it together?" William suggested, his voice gentle. "I think Great-Gran would like that." The family gathered on the large sofa in the study, the children nestled between their parents. As they began to sing the familiar melody, their voices mixing together in the quiet room, something shifted. The heavy atmosphere that had settled over the palace like a thick fog began to lift, replaced by something lighter, but no less meaningful. When the song ended, they sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own memories of the remarkable woman who had touched all their lives so deeply. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somehow, Catherine felt as though Margaret was watching over them, pleased that her family was finding their way back to each other through their shared love and memories. "I think," Catherine said softly, "Great-Gran would want us to remember the joy she brought to our lives, not just the sadness of losing her. She used to say that grief was just love, with nowhere to go," William added. "But maybe we can find new places for that love. We can put it into the way we care for each other, the way we help others, the way we keep her memory alive." George looked up at his father with serious eyes that seemed older than his 10 years. "Does that mean we don't have to be sad anymore?" "No, darling," Catherine answered, stroking his hair. "It means we can be sad and happy at the same time. We can miss Great-Gran and still find reasons to smile. Love is big enough to hold all those feelings together." As the family continued to talk and share stories, the palace around them seemed to transform. What had been a house of mourning began to feel like a home filled with love again. The journey through grief was far from over. But for the first time since Margaret's death, they were taking the first tentative steps forward together. The children eventually fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted by their emotional day. William and Catherine covered them with soft blankets and dimmed the lights, content to watch their peaceful faces in the gentle glow of the fireplace. "She would be proud of them," Catherine whispered, her head resting on William's shoulder. "And proud of us. For finding our way through this together. She would be proud of you most of all," William replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "For showing them that it's okay to grieve, that love doesn't end, and that families support each other through the darkest times." As they sat together in the growing darkness, surrounded by their sleeping children and filled with bittersweet memories of the woman who had shaped their family in countless ways, William and Catherine began to understand that while their goodbye to Margaret Rose had been heartbreaking, her legacy of love would continue to guide them forward into whatever tomorrow might bring. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine stood at the counter, her hands covered in flour. She was attempting to recreate Margaret's famous chocolate chip biscuits, using the handwritten recipe card her grandmother had left behind. The paper was yellowed with age and stained with ingredients from countless baking sessions over the years. "More flour." "Mummy," Louis called out from his step stool beside her, enthusiastically dumping another cup into the mixing bowl without measuring. "Oh my goodness, Louis!" Catherine laughed, the sound surprising herself with its genuine warmth. It was the first time in a month that laughter had come so naturally. "I think Great-Grand's recipe calls for a bit less flour than that." Charlotte, ever the perfectionist at 8 years old, frowned at the recipe card. "Mummy, what does this word say?" Great-Grand's handwriting is very swirly. Catherine leaned over to look where Charlotte was pointing. The word was patience, written in Margaret's elegant script next to a small heart. Below it, in the same flowing handwriting, were the words, "The most important ingredient is not on this list. It's the love you put into everything you make." "It says patience," Catherine replied softly, her finger tracing the familiar handwriting. "And she wrote a note about love being the secret ingredient." George, who had been quietly reading at the kitchen table, looked up from his book. "Is that why our biscuits never taste exactly like Great-Grand's? Because we don't know how to put love in them the right way?" The question was so innocent and yet so profound that Catherine had to pause for a moment. She looked at her 3 children, their faces dusted with flour, their eyes bright with curiosity, and felt something shift inside her chest. For weeks, she had been so focused on the loss that she had forgotten about the gifts Margaret had given them. "I think," Catherine said, sitting down on Louis's stool so she was at eye level with all 3 children, "that Great-Grand put love into everything she did, not just her baking. She put love into the way she listened to our stories, the way she remembered what made each of us happy, and the way she always had time for us, no matter what else was happening in her day." William appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair still messy from sleep. He had been working late into the night, trying to catch up on the royal duties that had been postponed during the most difficult weeks of their mourning. "Something smells like home in here," he said, wrapping his arms around Catherine from behind. "We're making Great-Grand's biscuits," Charlotte announced proudly. "But Louis put in too much flour, so they might taste like chalk." "The best kind of disaster," William chuckled, ruffling Charlotte's hair. "Your Great-Grand once told me that the best recipes are the ones that go wrong in interesting ways. She said that's how you discover new favorites." As if summoned by the mention of family stories, George closed his book and joined the group around the kitchen counter. "Tell us more stories about Great-Grand," he requested. "Not sad ones. Happy ones." William and Catherine exchanged glances. They had spent so much time in recent weeks focusing on their loss that they had forgotten how much joy there was to be found in remembering Margaret's vibrant, full life. "Well," William began, settling onto one of the kitchen stools, "did I ever tell you about the time your Great-Grand decided to learn how to use a smartphone?" The children shook their heads eagerly, gathering around their father like moths to a flame. "She was 87 years old, and she marched into the phone shop and announced that she needed to learn about the texting because she wanted to send pictures to her great-grandchildren." William continued, his eyes twinkling with the memory. "The poor young man at the shop spent 3 hours teaching her, and by the end of the day, she was sending us pictures of her garden, her cat, her breakfast, and her feet." "Her feet?" Charlotte giggled. "She couldn't figure out how to turn the camera around," Catherine added, continuing to stir the biscuit dough. "For months, we received daily photos of her slippers, her shoes, and sometimes just the ground. She thought she was taking pictures of us through the phone." The kitchen filled with laughter as the children imagined their proper, elegant Great-Grand struggling with modern technology. It felt good to laugh about Margaret's quirks and adventures rather than only focusing on missing her. "What about the time she decided to dye her hair purple?" Catherine continued, surprising herself with how easily the happy memories were flowing now. "Purple?" Louis asked, his eyes wide with amazement. "Bright purple," William confirmed. "She said she was tired of being boring and beige and wanted to try something adventurous. Your mummy nearly fainted when she walked into the nursing home and saw her grandmother looking like a punk rock star. She looked ridiculous." Catherine laughed. "But she was so proud of herself. She said it made her feel young again. She kept that purple hair for 6 months, until it finally faded to a lovely lavender shade." As they shared these stories, something magical began to happen in the kitchen. The heavy cloud of grief that had been hanging over their family started to lift, replaced by warmth and connection. The children began sharing their own favorite memories of Margaret, each story more precious than the last. Charlotte remembered the time Margaret had taught her to waltz in the garden, spinning her around between the roses while humming an old song from her youth. George recalled the countless hours Margaret had spent helping him build elaborate castles with his building blocks, always patient when he wanted to start over or add just one more tower. Louis, though he was the youngest and his memories were shorter, remembered the way Margaret always saved him the last bite of whatever sweet treat she was eating, calling it the best bite and pretending it was a special honor just for him. As they talked, the biscuits baked in the oven, filling the kitchen with the warm, familiar scent of butter and chocolate. When the timer chimed, Catherine pulled out the trays, and the family gathered around to inspect their handiwork. "They look almost right," George observed, comparing them to his memory of Margaret's perfect biscuits. "They smell exactly right," Charlotte added, inhaling deeply. "Can we eat them now?" Louis asked impatiently, reaching toward the hot pan before Catherine caught his hand. "Let's wait for them to cool," Catherine suggested. "And while we wait, we can write down all the stories we just shared. I think Great-Gran would love knowing that we're keeping her memories alive this way." William found a notebook, and they took turns writing down their favorite Margaret stories. Some were funny, some were sweet, and some were simply ordinary moments that had taken on special significance now that she was gone. With each story they recorded, the children seemed to grow lighter, as if sharing these memories was lifting some invisible weight from their small shoulders. When the biscuits were finally cool enough to eat, the family gathered around the kitchen table for their taste test. Catherine bit into one nervously, worried that they wouldn't live up to the high standard Margaret had set. But as the familiar flavors hit her tongue, she realized something important. They didn't taste exactly like Margaret's biscuits. They tasted like something new, something that belonged uniquely to their family. They carried the essence of Margaret's recipe but were flavored with their own love, their own memories, and their own way of honoring the woman who had meant so much to them. "These are perfect," William declared, reaching for a second biscuit. "Different from Great-Gran's," Charlotte observed thoughtfully. "But perfect in their own way. Like how we're different now that she's gone," George added, with the startling insight that children sometimes possess, but still perfect as a family. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes again. But these were different from the tears she had been crying for weeks. These tears carried gratitude alongside the sadness, hope alongside the grief. That afternoon, they decided to take the remaining biscuits to Margaret's cottage. It was the first time since the funeral that Catherine felt ready to visit the place that had been so central to her childhood and her children's lives. The cottage sat at the end of a winding country lane, surrounded by the garden that Margaret had tended with such love and care. Even now, in late autumn, there were still roses blooming along the fence, and the herb garden still smelled of thyme and lavender. Catherine had inherited the cottage, but she hadn't been able to face the thought of going through Margaret's belongings or deciding what to do with the property. Today, however, as they walked up the familiar path with their basket of homemade biscuits, the cottage felt less like a shrine to loss and more like a celebration of a life well lived. "Can we go see the secret garden?" Charlotte asked, referring to the small, hidden space behind the cottage where Margaret had grown her prize-winning roses. "Of course," Catherine replied, surprised to find that the thought didn't bring the sharp stab of pain she had expected. As they explored the garden together, William and Catherine watched their children reconnect with this special place. They picked late-blooming flowers, collected interesting stones, and played hide-and-seek among the trees, their laughter echoing across the countryside. "She's still here, isn't she?" George said quietly, appearing beside Catherine as she stood looking at Margaret's favorite rosebush. "Not like actually here, but her love is still here." Catherine knelt down and pulled her son into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart. Her love is still here, in the garden she planted, in the cottage she filled with warmth, and in our hearts, where we carry all the lessons she taught us." As the sun began to set, the family gathered on Margaret's front porch, sharing their homemade biscuits and watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. For the first time since Margaret's death, they talked about the future instead of only dwelling on the past. They made plans to preserve the garden, to keep the cottage as a family retreat, and to continue the traditions that Margaret had started. They would come here for holidays and special occasions, filling the space with new memories while honoring the old ones. "I think," Catherine said as they prepared to leave, "that Great-Gran would be happy to know that her love is still bringing our family together. She would be proud that we're taking care of each other," William added, locking the cottage door and slipping the key into his pocket. As they drove away in the gathering darkness, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Peace. Not the absence of sadness, but the presence of acceptance. Margaret was gone, and they would miss her every day. But her love lived on in the family she had helped to shape, in the traditions she had passed down, and in the strength she had given them to support each other through even the most difficult times. The palace would always carry echoes of their mourning, but it was beginning to feel like home again too. 6 weeks after Margaret Rose's passing, Catherine woke before dawn with a sudden, urgent need to be in her grandmother's garden. She slipped quietly from bed, careful not to wake William, and made her way through the still sleeping palace to her car. The November air was crisp and filled with the promise of winter. But something inside her felt like spring was just beginning. When she arrived at the cottage, the morning mist was still clinging to the ground, and everything seemed wrapped in a peaceful, dreamy quiet. Catherine let herself into the garden and walked slowly to Margaret's favorite bench, the one positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun. As she sat there, surrounded by the sleeping roses and the gentle rustle of autumn leaves, Catherine finally felt ready to say the goodbye she hadn't been able to voice at the funeral. The formal ceremony had been beautiful, attended by hundreds of people whose lives Margaret had touched, but it hadn't felt personal enough. It hadn't felt like the intimate farewell that their relationship deserved. "Hello, Gran," Catherine whispered to the quiet garden. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come here alone. I wasn't ready before, but I think I am now." The words came slowly at first, then in a rush, as Catherine found herself telling Margaret everything that had happened since her death. She talked about the children's brave attempts to comfort their parents, about William's steady strength even when his own heart was breaking, about the way the palace had felt so empty without Margaret's weekly visits. "I've been so angry," Catherine admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "Angry that you left us. Angry that the children have to learn about death so young. Angry that I have to figure out how to be a mother and a princess and a grandmother to your memory all at once." As if in response to her words, a small red robin landed on the arm of the bench beside her. Catherine had never been superstitious, but Margaret had always claimed that robins were messengers of love from those who had passed on. The little bird sat fearlessly close, tilting its head as if listening to every word. "The children miss your stories," Catherine continued, addressing both the robin and the memory of her grandmother. "They keep asking me to tell them about your childhood, about the war years, about how you met Grandpa. But my versions aren't as good as yours. I don't have your gift for making even the smallest moments sound like adventures." The robin chirped once, then flew to perch atop Margaret's prize-winning rose bush, the one that had been her pride and joy for 30 years. Catherine smiled through her tears. "They've been teaching me, you know, about grief, about love, about what really matters. George said something yesterday that sounded like something you would have said. He told Charlotte that missing someone is just proof that you were lucky enough to have them in your life." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. Inside was Margaret's antique locket, the one that held tiny photographs of all the family members she had loved throughout her long life. Catherine had been carrying it everywhere since the funeral, unable to bear leaving it behind but not yet ready to open it and see all those faces looking back at her. "I brought this for you," she said softly, placing the locket on the bench. "But I think I understand now that you don't need it anymore. You're not trapped in old photographs or keepsakes. You're alive in all the ways we love each other, in all the kindness we show to strangers, in every time we choose hope over fear." The sun was rising higher now, burning away the mist and warming Catherine's face. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine Margaret sitting beside her on the bench, offering the gentle wisdom that had guided Catherine through every major decision of her adult life. What would Margaret say about the plans Catherine and William had been discussing? The charity foundation they wanted to establish in her memory focused on supporting elderly people who had lost their families. The scholarship program they envisioned, helping young people pursue education regardless of their financial circumstances. The community garden project they hoped to launch, bringing neighbors together to grow food and friendship in equal measure. Catherine knew exactly what Margaret would say. She would be proud but not surprised. She would remind Catherine that the best memorials weren't made of stone or bronze, but of action and love. She would encourage them to dream bigger, reach further, and never underestimate the difference that one family could make in the world. "We're going to be okay, Gran," Catherine whispered. "It's going to hurt for a while longer, maybe forever in some ways. But we're going to be okay. You taught us how to love each other well, and that's enough to carry us through anything." When Catherine finally left the garden that morning, she felt lighter than she had in months. The grief was still there, but it no longer felt like a weight pulling her down. Instead, it had transformed into something that felt almost like fuel, energy she could use to honor Margaret's memory through action and service. She returned to the palace to find her family just waking up. William was in the kitchen making breakfast, and the children were still in their pajamas, sleepy-eyed and warm from their beds. "Where did you go, Mummy?" Louis asked, climbing onto her lap for their usual morning cuddle. "I went to say goodbye to Great-Grand Margaret," Catherine replied honestly. "A private goodbye, just between the two of us." "Are you sad?" Charlotte asked, studying her mother's face with the keen perception that 8-year-olds possessed. "I'm many things all at once," Catherine answered. "Sad, grateful, proud, hopeful. It's possible to feel all of those things at the same time when you love someone as much as we loved Great-Gran." George, who had been quietly eating his toast, looked up with serious eyes. "Does this mean we're done being sad about her dying?" "No, sweetheart," Catherine said gently. "We might feel sad about missing her for the rest of our lives, and that's okay. But we're also going to feel happy about having known her, excited about the projects we're doing in her memory, and grateful for all the love she taught us to share." William joined them at the breakfast table, sensing that something significant had shifted in his wife's mood overnight. "How was your visit to the cottage?" he asked quietly. "Peaceful," Catherine replied, and clarifying, "I think I'm ready to start making some of the plans we've been discussing." Over the following weeks, the palace became a hub of activity as the family threw themselves into creating Margaret's memorial foundation. The children helped design the logo, a simple drawing of the garden bench where Margaret had shared so many stories. They wrote letters to potential donors, sharing memories of their great-grandmother and explaining why her legacy mattered. The response was overwhelming. Letters and donations poured in from people who had known Margaret personally, from strangers who were touched by her story, and from other families who had experienced similar losses. Within a month, they had enough funding to launch all 3 of their planned projects. The scholarship program would help 20 young people each year pursue higher education. The Elderly Support Network would provide companionship and practical assistance to seniors who had outlived their families. The community gardens would transform unused urban spaces into places where neighbors could gather, grow food together, and build the kind of community connections that Margaret had always valued. As Christmas approached, the family made the decision to spend the holiday at Margaret's cottage rather than in their usual elaborate palace celebrations. They wanted to be surrounded by her memory, her warmth, and the simple pleasures she had always treasured. On Christmas morning, they gathered around the small tree they had decorated with ornaments Margaret had collected over the decades. Each decoration told a story, held a memory, represented some small joy from years past. "I have something for each of you," Catherine announced, producing 3 small packages wrapped in Margaret's favorite lavender paper. Inside each package was a small cutting from Margaret's rose garden, carefully prepared for planting. "Great-Gran always said that the most beautiful gardens were the ones that grew in many places," Catherine explained. "She wanted each of you to take part of her garden wherever life might lead you." The children held their rose cuttings carefully, understanding the responsibility they represented. These weren't just plants. They were living connections to the woman who had shaped their understanding of love, family, and what it meant to make the world a little more beautiful. "We can plant them at the palace," George suggested. And then wherever we live when we grow up, we can take cuttings and plant new gardens. So great-grand's roses will keep growing forever, Charlotte added, catching the beauty of the concept. Like her love, Louis said simply. And everyone agreed that he had understood perfectly. Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep by the fireplace, William and Catherine sat together in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance and thinking about the year that was ending and the new one that lay ahead. She would be proud of us, William said quietly, his arm around his wife's shoulders. She would be proud of them, Catherine replied, nodding toward their sleeping children. Look how they've grown through this experience. They're braver, more compassionate, more aware of what really matters. That's Margaret's gift to them, even in her absence. And to us, William added, this experience has changed us too. We're more present with each other, more grateful for ordinary moments, more committed to using our position to make a real difference. Catherine nodded, thinking about all the ways Margaret's death had transformed their family. The grief had been real and deep, but it had also opened them to new understanding, new purpose, new ways of loving each other and the world around them. As Big Ben chimed midnight in distant London, marking the beginning of a new year, Catherine felt Margaret's presence not as a ghost or a shadow, but as a living force of love that would continue to guide their family through whatever joys and sorrows lay ahead. The palace might have been in mourning when Margaret first left them, but it was no longer a house of sadness. It had become something richer and more meaningful. A home where love persisted beyond loss, where grief transformed into gratitude, and where one extraordinary woman's legacy would continue to bloom in the lives of those she had loved so well. Outside the cottage windows, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the sleeping garden in a blanket of pristine white. Come spring, Margaret's roses would bloom again, just as her family had learned to bloom again, carrying her love forward into all their tomorrows.